Hi, everyone, and welcome to this new episode of EuroIntervention Journal on Air. And I'm very happy to discuss together with my colleague and friend Arif Khokhar today with you the data coming out from a very interesting paper just published on EuroIntervention that is an in-depth analysis of the events happening in the NOTION-2 trial. So, hi Arif, how are you?
I'm good, thank you. Thank you, Chiara. Pleased to be here with you, and thank you for the invitation.
Thanks for joining us because indeed you are the first author of this paper. And I mean, after the Notion-2, we opened the door in interventional cardiologists when we talk about do we treat this patient with TAVI? And even last guidelines just tell us, yes, go for TAVI. But indeed, which was the need for you to go deep into the analysis of the results of this big trial and in order to understand what exactly?
Yeah, so I think that's a good way to start. So just a little bit of background for those of you who are not familiar with the Notion-2 trial. This was a randomized controlled trial comparing TAVI versus surgery. The unique elements here was that this was, first of all, a truly low-risk population, so STS score 1.1%, which is in keeping with other low-risk trials. But what was truly unique here is that we really had a young population. So these are patients aged between 60 and 75 years old, with a median age actually of 71 years old. So that was number one of the key things. It was truly a young low-risk population. The second thing is, unlike other randomized trials, bicuspid patients were actually included in this population. So we had about a quarter of the population actually had true bicuspid severe aortic stenosis. So this randomized trial then basically incorporated this study population. And the main headline, we have to recognize humbly that it was perhaps some underpowering. But in general, we saw that there was equipoise for tricuspid aortic stenosis between surgery and TAVI. But on the bicuspid side, although not statistically significant, there were some worrying signals in terms of bicuspid aortic stenosis and TAVI. And now we have 3-year data, which was just published in Circulation by my colleague, who showed that actually these results that we first saw with Notion-2, which was up to 1 year, are really stable up to 3 years. So again, tricuspid, low-risk patients, good equipoise for TAVI and surgery. In bicuspids, a signal that we need to take care of certain things.
So you pointed out two real important things, the young patient and the bicuspid. This background was really useful because today we talk about TAVI in young patient and in bicuspid. And this was the first in randomizing even this kind of anatomy. But otherwise, we can see that in many registries, people treat bicuspid with different platforms, and it seems, to go quite well comparing when with tricuspid as well. What sorted out in your paper for bicuspid exactly? Why this patient didn't go so well as the tricuspid?
Yeah, so in this particular paper, this was a sub-study. And what we decided to do is there was this signal, we wanted to study it more. And specifically, we analyzed every single cardiovascular death and or stroke, which could be major disabling or minor, to try to understand what was happening and what patterns did we learn. So what did we learn? Well, indeed, just to come back to the tricuspids, you had very good in terms of mortality. You had no mortality in the TAVI arm, and so clearly low risk young patients, we can do a good job. On bicuspids, we saw two mortalities in the TAVI arm, and both mortalities occurred in patients who had Sievert's type 2 bicuspid. And that's the important thing. So at one patient, it happened at the time of predilatation with annular rupture, and the balloon size was appropriately matched to the annulus based on pre-CT measurement. And the second one was a little bit later on after the procedure, but the patient suddenly collapsed and had a huge hemothorax and a huge collection of blood in the thoracic cavity. So probably there was some type of contained rupture that happened, which then eventually become unstable and the patient passed away. But the key message here was that both those mortalities in TAVI were related in type 2 bicuspid. And I think
So
that's, yeah.
we can say that it's not real the bicuspid that we encounter every day, but for sure you are sorting out that this is a very complex phenotype, right?
Exactly. I mean, I think nowadays the classification has changed somewhat. So this type 2 bicuspid now would actually be called a unicuspid valve. And certainly we know now with the knowledge that we have that this is not suitable for TAVI. It just so happened that when the trial was designed at the time, there was knowledge of treating a type 2 bicuspid with two calcified raphes was not there. And there was no screening committee at the time for bicuspid phenotypes. And I think this is a really important lesson for our community, is this importance that bicuspid is not a binary thing. It's not a binary phenotype that you're tricuspid or you're bicuspid. There's a whole heterogeneous spectrum of bicuspid phenotypes we can encounter, and type 2 is a real red flag.
No, I like saying that each bicuspid is original for itself. Indeed, you never have the same. But above all, when you move into, we can say classification, but indeed, it's just, I think, the complexity of the anatomy itself, made probably above all by the calcium. So probably we cannot really treat bicuspid, as you said. Of course, we can have different hard phenotype of tricuspid in terms of calcification. When we move to bicuspid, like the unicuspid or too rough calcified or highly calcified, sometimes, according to the different basic anatomy of this population, we cannot really treat them in a randomized all comers. Probably there are bicuspid that are more suitable, and there are other that really cannot be randomized to surgery or TAVI because the outcomes are made out by the basic phenotype. But mortality is not the only thing that you encountered more in bicuspid than tricuspid. What else did you find out?
Yeah, so if we think of stroke, so really, we're interested in hard clinical endpoints, things that matter to our patients. Yes. So here we looked at stroke, and really there's different ways of looking at stroke. There is your acute, let's say, peri-procedural stroke, and then there's a stroke that happens later on. Focusing purely on the acute peri-procedural stroke, we saw that in the bicuspid patients who underwent TAVI, there were two patients who had this acute peri-procedural stroke at time of valve implantation. We then analyzed exactly these patients to try to understand what happened. Both of them were type 1 calcific raphe and very heavy degree of calcification, number one. Number two, both of them were being treated with self-expanding valves, in this case, the Evolut platform. And number three, both of them involved multiple repositioning maneuvers. So in one case, what happened is the valve went in, there was a significant infold, and that necessitated the valve being removed, taken out, go back in, multiple repositioning maneuvers. So I think altogether was something like 6 or 7 repositionings. In the other patient, there was a total of 8 repositioning maneuvers. So we do have to also understand a little bit what type of valve we're using and how we implant that in a very, very hostile calcific environment. So self-expanding can be more forgiving in bicuspids, it's true, especially because you can reposition it many times, but this comes at a cost potentially and may pay a penalty. So we have to be perhaps even more focused and even more alert to try to achieve a single shot, one-time deployment if possible.
I think you marked out a very important point, even because indeed with your trial, you just underlined again that it's probably all about calcium, as we saw even in previous very important paper, probably published, like, for example, the one from Khokhar, telling the more is the calcium, the more is the risk. And you said that indeed the risk, if it's not made up by the calcium itself, is the need that the calcium require to manipulate more inside the aortic root. And of course, you can give whatever heparin you want to your patient, but if you really mechanically move and this calcium or fragment or whatever, the risk is even higher. So this is even more important because we are talking of your paper where the age of the patient was lower than what we can encounter in other registries. So of course, when we talk about stroke in 70, 71, as you said, years old patient, we are really not really happy at the end of the procedure. What shocked to me is that talking about young and stroke, of course, you reported and you pointed out that in bicuspid it was a little bit higher, but indeed you encounter stroke even in the tricuspid population. Did you analyze that in depth as well?
Yeah, this was even more, let's say, insightful and alarming for me. So what we found in the tricuspid cohort who are undergoing TAVI is that there was a pattern of delayed strokes or late strokes. So specifically after even about a month onwards, there were 5 late strokes. Now, one of them was related to infective endocarditis, but in the other 4, there were ischemic strokes. There was resolution of symptoms, so these weren't major disabling strokes, but nevertheless they occurred. And then we went in and looked at these procedures, the fluoroscopies, and there were even some CTs available, and they were all related to valve underexpansion. So in 3 of them, the CT, 4 of them clearly confirmed there was valve underexpansion, and in 1 of them, it was clear to see fluoroscopically. So I think this was an alarming finding because you're not seeing this in the surgical arm, this pattern of the delayed strokes, but you're seeing them in the TAVI arm. Is it something new? No. We have the accurate IDE trial, which clearly showed us that underexpansion can give you more stroke up to 12 months follow-up. And there's more and more data coming out now about this relationship between underexpansion and hard clinical endpoints. And I think this carries a lot of important messages for our community.
I think this is super important above all because we are talking about under expansion in the common anatomy, the tricuspid one, the one that we treat every day. And so because we are always talking about young patients, probably since guidelines say, okay, you can go for both since 70. I think we can go for both since 70 for sure, but since we are really not the surgeon, so we cannot really optimize in terms of, okay, I will open the valve as I want. We need to accomplish a very good result at the fluoroscopy and maybe even at the CT scan post if we have the possibility sometimes to look for it, because this underexpansion connection with the delayed stroke that you told us to be around 1 to 3 days after the TAVI is something that really, as interventional cardiologists, but as cardiologists at all, we don't want to see in this young patient. So probably if we rely on guidelines, we can just say that from this NOTION-2 in-depth analysis, you understood that TAVI and surgery can be a very good option for tricuspid patients. But if we look at the optimization, it should be the most effective one for TAVI in order to prevent any kind of, let's say, connection for underexpansion and bad outcome like stroke. But we will discover that the underexpansion is even related to more. When we look to bicuspid, probably yes, you think that we need real dedicated randomized trial, including at this point the good phenotype of bicuspid in order to have more reliable data. Because I mean, bicuspid type 2 is not the one that above all in the European continent we encounter, but of course I'm sure that in China and probably in Asia, they can see more of that. And if they go for TAVI in that population, probably the outcome is even worse. So what's your idea in order to open to probably future paper and publication? We don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think these are 2 areas that need to be explored. Yes, it is fine. We have lots of low risk data. We can go into young tricuspid straightforward patients and we get a good result. But one whole area of research that needs to happen is related to underexpansion. Number one, to confirm this working hypothesis that if you leave behind something constrained, you get, more death and stroke. You've seen it now in a few papers. And also to understand what is the mechanistic insights or the pathophysiological link between valve deformation and then eventually a hard death, stroke, or MI. So I think there's a whole field of research that needs to go in that direction. And then as we're going into younger patients, the thresholds that we have to achieve is really high. The stakes are higher here. You get even a small stroke in somebody at the age of 70, it's going to be very different to a stroke in somebody at the age of 90, for example. So the stakes are higher. We do have to optimize more. Then on the bicuspids, indeed, we need, of course, more randomized data to understand how, TAVI versus surgery. We need to understand different valve types. We need to even understand fully, I mean, how many conferences do we go to and you hear a whole session talking about 3, 4 different sizing strategies. So, we're still also trying to learn how best to implant our TAVI valves, what prosthesis, what depth, what size. And then ultimately, I think also what's really interesting when thinking more holistically about the heart team if we eventually end up in kind of an equipoise situation, which phenotype goes for surgery and which phenotype you can get a good result with TAVI. And ultimately, I think that's a challenge not just for interventionists or operators, but this is a question for cardiology in general, because we have to make a decision on these 70-year-olds, which way to send them. But at the moment, we don't really have that data. And I think that's our biggest challenge at the moment.
I really feel to thank you and the team behind this paper, because you outlined and sorted out new information for all the community. And of course, we do that in order to improve the treatment for our patients, because I mean, maybe we will be the patients tomorrow and we want to have the best
I hope not too soon.
treatment possible. But indeed, you pointed out very, very strong messages that in this context of new guidelines coming out for young patients, and considering even the correct phenotype for bicuspid for the percutaneous treatment, I think we really need to read this paper to keep in mind two important things. Young patients, we need to preserve the death and the brain. And of course, to do that, we need to improve our procedure and probably the indication for bicuspid phenotype to the good treatment in terms of TAVI or surgery. Thanks a lot, Arif. We hope to read more about what's happening in the north whenever you have new data coming. And we really thank you for being with us today and for sharing all these important messages.
Great.
And
Thank
for
you very
everybody,
much. Yeah.
and for everybody else, if you didn't have a look to this paper, do that. It's very nice and smart. And stay tuned for the next EuroIntervention Journal on air. Hi, everyone.
Brilliant. Thank you.
It's good.